things. Obviously, only share what you feel comfortable to share, but you know, or any conversation that happens here is confidential. There aren't, to my knowledge, any particular areas that I'll cover that in themselves will cause distress, but of course for any of us, even just thinking about the way our mind works and the way it can be unkind to us can be a bit triggering. So responsibility is to look after yourself. So if you decide you've had enough, you're always going to get the handout. That's no problem. And do interrupt to ask questions at any point. It's always the weirdest thing, really, isn't it? Just sitting, looking at a screen, talking at it. So whether it's chat, whether it's waving your hand, or just unmute yourself and interrupt me, totally fine. Okay. We won't be sort of reading all the bits on the handout today, but you will see it because I'm just using the handout. I'm not doing a separate PowerPoint, but there's just some images and bits that I think will be useful to use as we go along. So, third time lucky, I'm going to screen share. Let's hope that this works. You can see, right, when I'm here, I'm looking at you and at my main screen. When I'm here, I'm looking at my laptop, which is over here, where I need to just find my document, which of course I told you, Trish, it was going to refuse to. Oh no, it's back, it's all right, I found it. Okay, so I can see you, I can see the screen. Can everyone see my screen?
We can, yeah.
Brilliant. So I'm going to just get myself comfortable. So today, resilience, self-compassion. I mean, I think ultimately as therapists, as humans, you know, whichever hat I've got on myself, what we're trying to do is to increase our knowledge about ourselves or about the person that we're trying to support, and how do we convert that knowledge into action. So today, what I'm going to share with you, I hope, is some quite interesting knowledge, information from science, more general, broad science, from psychological science, and then thinking about some of the ways that we can put that knowledge and awareness into practice to help ourselves a bit more, because fundamentally, I hope I'm not alone in this. I don't think I am, but we're not always the nicest to ourselves. I think we often find that there are situations where if it was a friend or maybe our child or our partner or someone else in the situation, we would be far more compassionate, far less demanding, and certainly far less critical. Outwardly, at least to them, we may feel different inside, but how we express that would be very different. Yet when it's talking to ourselves, there's a lot of pressure, a lot of criticism, a lot of negativity. I don't know if that's something that others relate to, as I hope so. Anyway, so we're just going to start this off, just looking at the human brain. So a little bit of science here first. So as you can see from these my nice Google images, we have evolved, and we've evolved over hundreds of millions of years. We started with what we call the reptilian brain, so this bit down here, and that's very much just in control of innate, automatic, self-preserving behaviour to ensure survival of the individual and of the species. And scientists feel that very amusing to say that the reptilian brain is only interested in the 4 Fs, which are feeding, fighting, fleeing, and having sex. And that has maintained, and across the evolution, those 4 things remain important and equally important to humans today. Anyway, a bit later, sort of some 200 million years later, the mammalian brain evolved. This is the limbic system, sort of more emotionally connected. So this part of the brain here, the creatures, the animals with this mammalian brain had a greater interest in ways of caring for their offspring, and were motivated to engage in social bonding, communication, play, and affection in a way that that reptiles weren't. There were motives such as avoiding harm, seeking out food, sex, and wanting to care for others and wanting to have status within groups. And the emotions that come with that mammalian brain, the very raw emotions, anger, anxiety, sadness, joy, the emotions that take us sort of very directly towards or away from danger or sort of survival. And then onwards went the evolution till we end up with our human brain. So this is our higher brain. Now, it's this brain that has enabled us to do all the amazing things that humans have achieved. The fact that we are sat today with however many there are of us in this group, looking at screens, each scattered around our homes and the country, being able to have these conversations is thanks to the power of the human brain, that it enables us to imagine things. If you think about architecture, someone designing, you know, a building, they're having to imagine what that might look like in reality. Art, again, drawing so much into imagination. Our imagination also helps us to navigate social relationships. If you think about when you've arranged a party for someone or bought a gift for someone, you've been thinking about them, imagining, putting yourself in their shoes, imagining what they would like. The human brain enables us to consider the future, to plan for things, to things that might happen and things that might not happen. And it also allows us to have what psychologists call metacognition. So that's the ability to think about thinking, which certainly manages to tie us in quite a lot of knots. The human brain allows for rumination. So that's reflecting on the past. So it's not just projecting and planning into the future and thinking about what happens, but it's thinking about past experiences and events. And that will be thinking with language and words, and it will also be thinking visually with images. And along with that also comes the ability to self-monitor, to self-identify, and to self-criticize. So what we've got here, as you can see, we have the old brain that, put very simply, is very much about survival. And then the new brain, which is about analysis. So can anyone think of a time recently when your old brain, so your old brain is the reptilian plus mammalian brain, when that might have been triggered? Can you think of any sort of situation? And what old brain emotion did the situation trigger? Oh, silence.
As in, like, what caused us to go into survival mode?
Yeah, exactly. That's, yeah.
So I guess, like, for me, like having loads of things personally happen. So, like, for example, my grandma passed away in December, so I went into survival mode, moved back in with my parents, got the comforts from home, other things that had happened in my personal life. So I guess that's me going into survival mode and kind of regressing into getting TLC from my dad.
Absolutely, that's a really good example. Thank you for sharing, Nisha. I think what's interesting there is you've identified the situation, which is the loss of your grandmother. I'm so sorry, that's still really recent, isn't it? And that the emotion that will have been triggered there, I imagine certainly sadness, but there may have been other emotions that came with it. There may have been anxiety, there may have been anger. And actually what it then did, your brain used those emotions to guide your behaviour. So what it made you want to do was to be back close, connected to your family, to a place of comfort and safety. So it worked really well to serve to protect you in a time of need. It identified the danger. Okay, these are not nice feelings to have when we're on our own. So actually we need to produce some emotion that will cause a behaviour to get us closer to what's important and what's necessary at these difficult times. So that's a really good example. My favourite animal bits. I've got some pictures now, Tricia, you'll be pleased to see. So in terms of just thinking a little bit about the animal brain, the mammalian brain, and the simplicity of the mammalian brain, and that sort of those survival triggers, I want to just spend one moment on my zebra story. So we see some zebras feeding on the savannah, and they spot a tiger, a lion even, on the hunt. What do the zebras feel? Anyone can just shout out.
Fear.
Yep, brilliant. And what do the zebras do when they're frightened?
They run away.
Yeah, perfect. Exactly. So they do the fleeing. Okay. Now, when the zebra is confident that they've outrun the lion or they've seen the lion slink away, what does the zebra then do? Any ideas?
I think this is the most interesting bit, isn't it? Because they just get on with their day.
Go straight back to eating again. So actually, for a zebra, they identify the danger. Their threat system in their body is activated. Adrenaline is produced. Stress hormone cortisol is produced. They get into that fight and flight mode and they run. But as soon as the danger is no longer visible, smellable, hearable, touchable, they then return to the act that they were doing previously. In this case, eating. I guess if they'd been having a rest before, they might have returned to that. What we don't see is zebras like up on their hind legs, backed up against a tree, going, oh my God, like what if that lion's just gone to get their friends? Should I try and climb the tree? Maybe they're going to be better at climbing than me. Maybe I definitely should not eat anything today because I need to know I can run fast. What we don't see is zebras engaging in that sort of process, because zebras don't have this new brain. They don't have what we have, which gets us stuck in these tricky thinking, feeling loops. What we find with the new brain is it has this ability to keep us online. So I've got an example here, and I always quite like this example because it's always very much how I feel before I do any of these groups. I really enjoy doing these groups, but I always feel anxious about social talking in any, social public speaking, presenting in any sort of way. So when we come into a situation, unlike animals, we don't just sort of work on the five senses planes. It's not just what we can see, hear, smell, taste, touch that causes us to react. We also are threatened by sort of social danger and internal experiences. The thoughts that we might have will trigger the exact same old animal brain. So let's give an example here. So I have the thought, I'm going to mess up this presentation. So I have that little worry lying awake this morning. So what happens is that new brain triggers my old brain. So I start feeling a bit anxious, start feeling a bit tense. Then in response to that feeling of anxiety and tension, my new brain says, well, we better try and analyze and make sense of like these emotions. What's this about? So it tries to think a bit more about it. Okay, so why are you feeling anxious? You're going to mess up the presentation. Oh, because people might ask you questions that you can't answer. Oh God, well, that's going to be really terrible if that happens. So I start to feel a little bit more anxious about it. And then what happens is I can then kind of peel off into various different cycles. So maybe I can avoid doing it. I could pretend I'm ill. We're remote. I could pretend there's a glitch and I can just, my internet doesn't work. I can't work out how to screen share on, they sort these, everyone saw me at the start trying to find my way to get out of it. Unfortunately, we worked out the screen sharing, so I couldn't. But what you can see is that relationship between the new brain and the old brain means that we actually can keep our threat system activated. We keep that anxiety going. Similarly, my brain could have the thought, oh, I'm so rubbish. Why do I always worry about this? No one else would worry about this sort of situation. And that could trigger other feelings, sort of feeling, angry or very, self-critical, inferior. So we all find in our lives, I think on a day-to-day basis, in all sorts of areas, these little loops that we get stuck in, where actually there isn't a danger. There isn't a sort of life and death risk to ourselves. but we've got to worry about something where there is a potential for embarrassment or shame, social discomfort, it might be something like that. So it's there, but unfortunately, when that thought triggers our emotional system, it's the same threat emotional system that made those zebras run. We don't unfortunately have alternatives to it. So actually we can then very easily spiral. So here's a little example, a little sort of image of that here, really, that you can see that for a zebra, there's a threat. They go up, their threat system responds, they feel frightened, all of the physiological stuff happens that need to, they remove themselves from danger, and the threat level goes down really as soon as the danger's passed. And that's the joy of the old brain and the zebra. But if we want to be able to go to space and create buildings and have the sort of social relationships that we do, then we have to stick with this new brain, which, as you can see here, when the initial threat has passed, let's say there was a threat. Let's say I'm crossing the street. This actually happened the other day. I went to cross the street. It was a green man, and some person just scooched out in their car from behind the bus and round and turned right. Everyone was fine, but it was that moment where you go, like it felt like a real danger threat. My threat system went right up. So actually, once the car had gone, that was fine. Everyone was fine. Everyone crossed the road and everyone kept going on with their business. Threat is over. If I was a zebra, I'd go back to getting on with my business. But actually what we find happens is you then think, oh my God, what if I hadn't seen that car? What if I'd taken a few extra steps? What if that was my daughter crossing the road and, she isn't as quick and responsive to it as me? Maybe I'm making a really bad decision in my parenting, letting her walk home at 10 on her own. Maybe 10's far too young to walk home on her own. So actually what happens is we ruminate, we imagine worst outcomes, we become self-critical. And it's actually that's the space where we put so much time and energy that often leaves us then feeling sort of really lowly resourced and depleted when it comes to wanting to put our time and energy into what's important to us. Spending time with our family and friends, doing activities that, engage us and we enjoy, focusing on our jobs. So are there any recent situations that anyone can think of? Just an example, whether it's one that you've actually experienced or whether it's even a made up example, where you can identify that sort of tricky loop process being triggered. I'll move that down again for a moment. Anyone got an example?
Yeah, I do. A couple of weeks ago, we had a baby die that had come into the hospital a few times, and we'd known them very well.
Yeah.
I don't think that, looking at it, there was nothing we could have done to prevent the death, and the child died in intensive care, and there was no failure of care or anything.
Yeah.
But I got myself very stuck in a loop because I'd known this family for a very long time about, what if we'd done this? What if we'd done this?
Absolutely.
And I realised that I had continued to get myself in this loop, and I was struggling to get myself out of it. So very sensibly, I rang one of my good friends who's also a paediatrician, and I said, so-and-so, please help me to get my brain back on the right track. But I got myself stuck in it for many days before I got to that point.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, what a difficult experience. And thank you for sharing that, because that's, the sorts of experience that I'm sure all of you have experienced, or at least experienced similar. But it's a really good example of how that new brain, old brain loops can get stuck. And actually, thank you also for sort of following on and saying that you then took action on that. Actually, you used your knowledge, which is, when I'm thinking and feeling in this way, this isn't good for me. I therefore need to find a way to help myself. Okay, actually talking to a friend, a colleague is a good way to do that. So that's great. So thank you so much for sharing, Stephanie. So I can say to you, Stephanie, and anyone else who was having thoughts about things that have happened, that it's definitely not just you, that we've evolved for survival and reproduction, not happiness. So the protective emotions, anxiety, fear, anger, disgust, they're the biggest players. But we do live in a society that's obsessed with happiness. And so it's really easy to feel that there's something wrong with us. I don't know how often in the week I have this thought, but it's often, which is, oh, so-and-so wouldn't feel this way in this situation, or so-and-so would manage that differently. We sort of do this constant social comparison. And of course, the world of social media doesn't help us in that way, because actually that's a place where people are endlessly sharing information, you know, ready and open and asking for social comparison. And of course, it's generally not even an accurate reflection of life. So these thinking and feeling loops between the new brain competencies and the old brain emotions can really cause us a lot of distress and difficulties. And of course, there's situations where those distress and difficulties become impactful to the extent that we don't feel we can actually engage with our life in the way we want to. We're not being able to do our job effectively. We're not relating to the people in our life in the way we want to. And it's at those sorts of points where people do go and see psychologists or have counselling or take some time off and take action. But actually, there's also this lower level that we all have all the time of this sort of constant, I like to call it something like the Daily Mail headlines. It's just sort of this, just trashing yourself constantly in all sorts of situations. And actually, mostly, we don't tend to seek help for that sort of thing because we just think, oh, well, everyone else wouldn't have this. But it's because there's something wrong with me. So we so easily go into that mode. So what can we do? How can we help ourselves a bit in this situation and look after our well-being a bit more? So before I might just do that down like that for a minute. So resilience. This is a word that I would say 100% of the time that we bring it up has an imbalance between positive and negative commentary on it. But I'd be really interested just to hear from any of you about when you hear that word resilience, what it means to you. Is it positive, negative, something you have a set amount of, something you can develop? What's the sort of narrative around it for you?
Marietta's got her hand up. Marietta?
So I almost look at myself as the resilient expert. I normally sort of define it as bouncing back wherever I am. At the low point, I always bounce back. And I mean, that's pretty much what resilience means for me.
Yeah, lovely, brilliant, thank you.
I think it depends on the way it's used, I suppose. Like, there's lots of discussion about it that's ends up being like that we should be more resilient, which ends up being negative. But you know, we've got plenty of resilience to get where we are, so it's a good thing.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think you're right as well that, you know, whilst we can kind of cognitively think about resilience as it's reflected, and you gave a definition there, here's just another version of that definition, but the ability to remain flexible in our thoughts, feelings and behaviours when faced by a life disruption or extended periods of pressure, so that we emerge from difficulty stronger, wiser and more able. So, you know, we do understand that that's the definition, and I'm sure we've all had times in life when we have, you know, can look back probably and reflect and think, yeah, I was resilient in that moment. I did manage to tolerate a lot of disruption, a lot of pressure, and continue to function in the way that I needed to. But as you said, there's also this flip side of this, you know, the sort of demands that come often within the workplace that can make us either implicitly or indeed, as for some people, explicitly have the idea that if only I was more resilient, I would be able to do, you know, 2 night shifts on the trot, or if only I was, you know, this, that and the other. So it's sort of this pressure that somehow there's a space for us to fail because we're not resilient enough. So what do we know about resilience? Firstly, we know that it's a fluid process, it's not fixed, and that we all start at different places. So if we're thinking about the genetic side of things, it's not a level playing field. Some people just have to work harder on it. So I think, you know, you will find people just, when they're talking about children, describe children as resilient. Oh yes, you can tell they're going to be very resilient, or not, you know, so that narrative starts very early on. I think what people are identifying there is that sort of start point where people are at. And genetics does play a part in our sensitivity to stress. And then that paired with our childhood experiences, and I mean both experiences that have been aversive, where we've had to learn to manage difficult situations, also our experiences of care and how we've internalized those senses of care. That's going to be really important. And it's interesting in terms of thinking about that sort of genetic and childhood experience relationship. There's this idea that people, putting it very simply, but are either born as orchids or dandelions, and that people who are orchids, people who have that genetic propensity, are actually at higher risk of psychological difficulties if they're not cared for properly. Whereas people who are dandelions can thrive even in the roughest of conditions. So actually you could put two children in parallel home environments, and actually depending on their genetics, depending on whether they are that more fragile orchid or the more sturdy, I'm going to get on through everything dandelion, it will affect how they experience life. But what we do know is that resilience is very much about learning. And we learn from adversity. We learn from any, adversity is any situation that we find difficult, hard, uncomfortable, unjust. And from every one of those situations that we have experienced from day dot, we have responded to that situation. And I'm sure the ways we respond has varied. We've then had an outcome from that situation. So what happened? We then take meaning from that outcome. We analyze, we use that new brain. Okay, in this situation, I did this, this was my experience, and this was the outcome. Do I want to repeat that next time, or do I want to do it differently? And what we do over time is develop a template to take those skills of resilience forward to future adversity. So resilience is absolutely something that is learned, and therefore we can continue to learn and strengthen our resilience. So there are times when we feel more resilient than others. Contribute. There'll be other factors that contribute. Can I ask you just to take a moment to do a little exercise, and you can just do it in your head, this first little bit. Just give just a moment's thought to how resilient you feel now. So just in this moment, just reflect back on the hours of the day you've had so far and how resilient you feel. Maybe even give yourself a score out of 10. 10 is you're absolutely nailing resilience, feeling as strong and as flexible as a person could, and 0 is feeling very flaky and a heap on the floor. We've all been at both ends. So have a think where you are today, and then think about a similar time last week. So think back to, what day are we on, Thursday? So sort of think back to mid to late week last week, and whether there is any difference between that. And some people may notice a big difference, some may notice small, and some may notice none. But what sorts of things make a difference to you in terms of how resilient you're feeling? Just shout out any examples.
The basics, like if I've eaten, if I've slept.
Yeah.
They make a massive impact if I'm feeling up for a challenge or not, or something to like, get back on the course or not.
Yeah. Brilliant, thanks. I'm sure everyone else relates to that too. Any other things that make a difference to how resilient you feel?
I think maybe like if you've got things which are going well in one area of your life versus others, because those things that are going well in one area of your life will hopefully be able to build you up to build the other areas which might not be going as well. Yeah,
no, I think that's a really valid point. And I think, for example, if we're having a really tough time at work, if actually our home life and our social connections are feeling very sort of strong and supportive, then we do feel more resilient to deal with that more challenging time. So what we've got here is a little sort of pulling together of examples, and actually there are more things that we can put in these lists. They're by no means cover everything, but this idea of personal resilience, that we all have all of these qualities and more, and that at different times we're going to have different balances in those different areas. So our physical sort of being, of course, that was mentioned there, that makes a huge difference. If we've not sort of meeting those needs in ourselves. We'll be irritable, tired, poor concentration, anxious, all sorts of things. We've got our emotional personal resilience, whether we're being particularly oversensitive or maybe insensitive, whether we're feeling quite disillusioned by a situation, whether we're feeling overwhelmed by a situation, whether we're feeling, you know, low in mood. All of those are going to be signs that our emotional resilience is perhaps flagging a bit. We've then got the social side of our resilience, whether our relationships are feeling strong and supportive, whether we're feeling well connected. And of course, we're all part of systems. You know, we're in our families of origin, families that we've created, friendship groups, work groups, broader society. You know, there's a lot of different systems for us to feel connected, and therefore a lot of systems for us within which we can feel disconnected. And that is going to affect our resilience. And then we've got the psychological parts of our personal resilience. Here in this list, we've got attentional processing, so where we focus our attention, the ability to think flexibly and cope with difficult situations, and self-compassion. And when we're low on the psychological resilience, then we can become very preoccupied, perhaps very rigid in our thinking about things or approach to a situation. That, you know, I certainly noticed that when I've had a very full and busy and draining week, perhaps when I'm in debate with my children about whether or not they're right or I'm right about something, or whether I'm going to win the decision making or they're going to win the decision making, I will be more rigid that I'm right and my decision goes when I'm feeling a bit less psychologically resilient. My resource is lower, and I'm sure you can all think of your own situations like that. We're a bit more likely to feel anxious, a bit more likely to catastrophize situations. And it's also within that area that we can experience that perfectionism also fits in that. And I know that's something that Nisha did flag up as sort of a theme and a topic that have been sort of spoken about. But, you know, the flip side of perfectionism is obviously self-criticism, and that comes out really strongly when we're feeling low on our personal resilience. So it's an evidence-based fact. We know this from psychological science, that the way we interpret events is important for how we respond in the moment, and build a template for how we will respond in similar situations in the future. Okay, so just to spend a little moment looking at how we think about things. So this is particularly in terms of thinking, but we're just going to focus a little bit more on the psychological aspects of personal resilience. So thinking about attentional processing and flexible thinking. Think about the situation about how do we think about positive and negative life events, what they mean to us. So we've got the person who may view a negative life event as a challenge, and the person who may view the negative life event as a threat. We've got the person who may view the positive life event as a coincidence. And we've got the person who may view the positive life event because of themselves. And actually, depending on how we balance that out, how we appraise the situation. Did this terrible situation occur because I'm useless? Or wow, was that actually quite successful because I really put in the time there? Depending on whether we go into something thinking, we could go back to the situation of me coming into this today, if I just think, oh my God, I'm going to mess up, I'm not going to be able to use the technology, I'm going to bore people, I'm going to say the wrong things, forget what I'm saying, whatever it is. I could have that list of things. Now, if the weight of that threat outweighs my sense of, I really enjoy being part of this program, and it's really nice to be able to potentially, you know, share some information and make a difference, you know, even if that's small. And actually, I do find it anxiety provoking, but it's really good to challenge myself, and I find I can do it. So if I start to think of it about in that sort of way, then, you know, actually the danger as I perceive it in the situation doesn't exceed my resource or my ability. And indeed, I may actually gain from it. I always come away from these thinking that was really nice, whether it was particular conversations, the people I saw, whatever the opportunity was. So whether the danger is greater than our ability to manage it, or whether the danger doesn't exceed our resource, how we think about it has a big effect on how we appraise the situation, and therefore how we're going to learn about it moving forward. There's a really interesting study where two groups matched for, you know, all the normal things matched across the pairs of groups, are given a task, the exact same task, but the way they're given the instructions is different. So one group is given instructions which very much uses words that we might associate with threat and pressure and stress, so things that are going to trigger our threat system that we're going to start to feel anxious about. And the other group are given the exact same task, but are given sort of just very functional instructions about what they have to do. And what the researchers found was that those who'd been given instructions that encouraged them to think about the stress and pressure that might be brought about by doing this task increased their blood pressure, constricted their airflow, led to glucose depletion and lower energy. They made more mistakes when completing the task, and they were more anxious. The other group, exactly identically matched group, who were given very different set of instructions with no emphasis on, you know, sort of what the internal experience of it might be. They had lower anxiety, they could think more clearly, they could focus, and the physiological sort of variables were in the positive direction. So it is really, really interesting, just in terms of how we think about something literally affects our physiology and our performance, physiology, psychology, and performance. It's just really helpful to sort of bear those things in mind as you go through life and approach situations. So what we do know is that another thing we know from the great researchers is that people who engage in self-compassion and take a more balanced or mindful view of their situation feel less isolated when faced with a challenge and are better able to reframe negative perceptions and improve their resilience. So what does compassion mean to you? I've got a definition here, so we've got it as a meaning, but how does it, what's the narrative for you in your life? Where do you notice yourself being compassionate, showing compassion?
So for me, I guess with my, not only my patients, but my colleagues and my friends.
Yeah.
When they have difficult situations, having that compassion towards them is where it happens the most. Not to myself though.
No, it's very interesting, isn't it? There's always a very, very long queue of people before us. A little bit like the lockdown supermarket queue, I feel, in my local Sainsbury's. I'm imagining everyone else feels very similarly, that it's actually very easy to be compassionate, to connect with our compassionate self when we're thinking about other people and other people's experience, that we have that sensitivity to suffering in others and we're committed to alleviating and preventing it. But compassion also covers sensitivity to suffering in ourselves, and similarly to there needing to be a commitment to alleviate and prevent it. And as I said, we tend to put that really low on the priority list.
I think, Lucy, this is something that paediatricians are particularly bad at doing, is being self-compassionate, and our mismatch between compassion for other people, other trainees, other doctors, other healthcare professionals, and our patients massively outstrips our own self-compassion. This comes from a long set of conversations I've had with Claire Gerarda, who runs the Physician Health Partners, PHP, who tells me that actually paediatricians are the worst at carrying on when they're in all sorts of bad things, in bad places themselves, because their patients and their colleagues need them to be with them. So they're most likely to have worse amounts of PTSD and still be working compared to any other professional group. So we seem to be very, very good at compassion, except for ourselves.
Yeah, it is really interesting, isn't it? And depending on whether we end up in paediatrics or adult health or both, it's obviously going to be part of our life experiences and our psychology and how we've grown up. I think you echo there something I've certainly heard very, very much so and very repeatedly And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's very evident that it's not a lack of the ability to engage with compassion and the skills required to be compassionate. The very fact that you're doing that day in, day out shows you can do it. But why is it that we find that so difficult to turn inside? Well, we go back to some of the things we've talked about already today, and that the idea that, of course, it's the protective emotions that are more powerful. They're the ones that we notice. And when in ourselves, we've got that anger, fear, anxiety. We seem to leap on that in a very unkind way. Whereas when we see it in others, we leap to protect. We do approach things in a very different way. So in terms of the literature sort of taken from compassion-focused therapy, there's different sort of qualities of compassion, and the sort of main two I was going to speak about now is courage, the first. Courage being the preparedness to pay attention to things that are difficult without turning away, avoiding, or switching off. I think we can probably all think of times, I would hazard a guess, even in the last week, maybe even the last 24 hours, where we have avoided, turned away from, switched the telly on so we don't need to think, poured a glass of wine to calm the system. I'm sure you can all identify things. And within the kind of compassion language, courage would be about facing that, turning towards it, sitting with the discomfort rather than taking action. Just a little exercise to sort of just bring this to mind. You just think of a recent example where you might have had a conversation with someone that was awkward. So if you just bring that to mind, awkward in whatever way. And then think about how you'd rate your performance in that situation. You know, how well you communicated, how well you listened, how well you engaged with it, and do that out of 10. And then think about, so I've given the example here, let's say you've rated it a 6. Why isn't it a 5? What is it about how you approach that situation and how you're reflecting on it now that has put it at the level it's at? Why is it not lower? And what would need to be different for it to be higher? For it, if we're at a 6, for it to move to a 7. And this is a really kind of quick way of reviewing thoughts and feelings and sort of scope for change and improvement in any area of life. But actually, by doing this in a reflective way on the back of difficult situations, we develop the compassionate quality of courage, because it's encouraging us to move towards what made something difficult. Let's sit with that rather than just brushing that away. Okay, now the second compassionate quality. So we've done a little bit on courage and now a little bit on wisdom. So wisdom tells us that good intention is not enough. We also need a variety of skills to help us to work with our own and others' difficulties and distress. Quite a good example I like, a little story for this one, is if you think about you know, you're walking along the side of a river and you see someone struggling. They can't swim, they're getting caught up in the currents and they're in the middle and they're waving and shouting. You can't swim, but you want to help. So you decide to jump in the water and try. And actually now what we have is 2 people waving their arms around, caught up in the current. So your compassionate side was there and strong. I can see someone suffering. I can see someone struggling. I want to help. But what you didn't engage, what we didn't engage was wisdom. That actually, in this situation, my jumping in the river is not going to help. That just means 2 people down, probably. Whereas actually, if I have a conversation with them, get some help, then I might be able to help the situation. So it's all very well to just feel I want to help. but it's actually thinking about what are the skills we need to help others and what are the skills that we need to help ourselves. And again, just going back really to what Jonathan touched on a moment ago, I'm sure, again, we're very, very effective at finding ways to support our partners, our friends, our colleagues, our children when they're in need, but much more difficult thinking about those skills for ourselves. So just in the last few minutes, I can see we've got about 10 minutes left. I wanted to just talk through a few skills. Again, this list can be expanded. We could spend a whole day across all of these different areas, but it was about just pulling out a few things that you might be interested to go and try, to think about, to explore a little bit more. Skills about how we develop that compassionate self. So I have put 4 down here for today. So the first one is to continually remind ourselves about common humanity. We didn't choose to be human. We didn't choose to have these genes. Goodness, we didn't even choose to be born. We certainly didn't choose to have these brains that get us caught in these loops. And we didn't choose to have negative thoughts and feelings. So it's not our fault. There is not something wrong with us. This is how we have evolved as a species, and it is ironically part of why we've evolved so successfully as a species. But we can take action to learn what to do with them, to reduce our suffering when we get caught up in these difficult sort of thought feeling patterns. So I think there's just something very powerful to just continuing to remember that we're all in this boat together. And I actually think that during this COVID and lockdown time, I think people, because there's been more limit to seeing people, people have talked a bit more about the struggle. And I think people have felt a greater sense of being in the same boat together. And I think that's probably been one thing that will be a real positive and a strength to all of us coming out of it. It's a shame that it takes a global pandemic for people to take that time to reflect, and it needs that sort of level of impact. But actually we do all struggle. We all feel anxious. We all feel sad. We all, when we don't do things effectively, criticize ourselves and don't look at the fact that maybe we just didn't understand or haven't learnt that skill, or one parenting didn't have that model to us in that way, but it's immediately that somehow we're failing. So I think that's a really important skill to just remember. The second one is to increase our awareness of the old brain, new brain loops. I hope just by some of the conversations today, just sort of talking back over the science as we did and looking back over that, highlighting some of those loops and patterns will help to bring that more into your awareness today. And as I said, you'll have these handouts, so go away and draw out some of your own loops. I'm sure you'll notice loads every day if you're anything like me, and look at, you know, which ones hook you in, which ones do you end up going further and further down the track with. And record keeping, or some people view it as journaling, you know, sort of lots of people, you know, do their record keeping in different ways. But it has been shown to be very effective for helping us to bring about awareness. So I've just got a little suggestion here you could just try, is recording for a week. Take 5 minutes at the end of each day to write down the types of loops you got into that day, or take regular notes throughout the day if that helps. There's a reminder to help you, but just increase your knowledge about yourself. We all know we get into these loops, we all know we're negative about ourselves, we've got that narrative. But actually, we can almost become a bit complacent with that. Oh yeah, I know, that's always how I am. Rather than, okay, well, this is interesting. What is it? What are the situations when I'm kind of getting stuck in that? What am I saying to myself? Why am I saying these things to myself? So actually starting to note things down is a really good way to begin to increase awareness. The third skill is about practicing stepping out of the loop. So as you'll remember, when we looked up at that example I gave, the loops sort of started to grow. You know, we can spiral into different areas, worst case scenarios, catastrophizing. And the thoughts that most hook us in and drag us off down the river with them, they're the ones that I think are particularly Daily Mail headliney. You know, they're the ones that they want to grab our attention. And they're the ones that we want to watch out for. So to this end, we certainly know from the research that mindfulness is probably the most powerful tool at our ready disposal, a skill to develop in order to help us to practice stepping out of the loop. But mindfulness comes from Eastern meditation practices, but has been used clinically by psychologists and other therapists alongside clinical practice for about the last 20 years or so, with the research base really strengthening for it, for helping not just day-to-day humans struggling, but also clinical populations. So mindfulness is about paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. It's about choosing and learning how to steer the focus of our attention. And our attention can be anchored to any sense, sound, smell, taste, sensation. And any activity can be carried out mindfully. So, for example, teeth brushing, that's something we all do every day, probably twice a day. How often do you actually spend that 2 minutes really attending to that experience of brushing your teeth? To what it feels like to squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, to what it feels like what does it even feel like when you put it on the toothbrush? I can't even remember. To the taste of the toothpaste. Where do we feel it in our mouth first, second, third? Does it fill the whole mouth? Is it just in one area? Temperature. What does that feel like during the process? Do we always follow the same route, or do we do it different every time? There's so much information in there, but because it's just habitual and not particularly interesting, we don't get caught up in it. But actually, if we, hear a bit of chat, there might have been a party happening that you weren't invited to. What? Suddenly, boom, we're caught in. Why have I not been invited to? Not that this party's happening anymore, but you know what I mean. Why am I not at that event? Why have people not thought about me? What is it I've said or done? And off we go, caught down this sort of rabbit warren. So mindfulness is about exercising that muscle in the brain, the skill of identifying, noticing that our mind has wandered, and to acknowledge it and bring our attention back to whatever the activity is we're doing mindfully, let's say focusing on the breath. And there's loads of great apps and all sorts of free resources that you can download for mindfulness, meditation, relaxation practices. They're all covered with those. Headspace is the app I personally use the most. I know it is used in the Return to Clinical Practice program. But mindfulness it's not something we achieve like learning to ride a bike, that once we can ride a bike, we then just do it, or driving a car. It's more akin to learning to play a musical instrument. So it's something that if you stop over time, you will lose that skill. Or going to the gym, perhaps if you've gone and done a lot of heavyweight training over a period of time and then you stop, you'll find you can't lift more than a tin of beans after a while. So it's gym for the brain, mindfulness. It's about strengthening that muscle. And it's really difficult to get a regular practice into life because it's hard to prioritize something that isn't instantly rewarding. That indeed may feel a bit aversive because it means prioritizing it over something else, taking time away from something else. It means being with our mind and letting our mind do what it does. So I think people tend to be great at saying, yeah, I'm going to do a mindfulness practice, and terrible at actually doing it regularly. I certainly hold my hands up to that. I'm on a very good streak at the minute, 145 days daily. I'm feeling very proud of myself. And I found by harnessing it to other parts of my daily routine very clearly, that it's now started to become habitual, a bit like, when you get off the loo and you wash your hands, whatever it is, something that one thing always just triggers the next without having to think about it so much. So definitely try what we call habit stacking to put it together with something else, and try it. It's better to do 3 minutes every day than it is to do 20 minutes on one day. Okay, so it's just about building up that practice, learning to be able to notice the self-criticism, the worry, and let it be. Just a bit of chatter. And then the last thing, I can see we're just creeping to the end for today, was about the final skill I want to talk about, was about self-kindness. As I said, I've no doubt you have lists of people in your lives to whom you are endlessly kind and endlessly doing lovely little things for and endlessly holding in mind. And we just are not so good at doing that for ourselves. And perhaps even when we do something kind for ourselves, we somehow undermine it. We then feel guilty for going out on that bike ride when it meant I left someone else with the children, or whatever it is. We find a way to take away from our pleasure from the experience of kindness. So here's just a little exercise that you can try away from here, is to read these instructions and set a timer for 10 minutes and write without stopping. So think of someone you love dearly and picture them in the same situation you're in. What would you say to them if they said they were struggling to do everything as well as they wanted to? Would you encourage them to work harder, or would you tell them to be easier on themselves and remind them of all the good they're doing? Write a letter to a friend who's going through exactly the same thing you are. What would you tell them? And then reflect on how that felt. And by doing that, it's not going to suddenly mean that there's waves of self-kindness reliably there, because as we've gone back to, it's our biology, it's our evolution. We're not going to be able to unconsciously override that, but we can consciously put in efforts to strengthen skills, to develop our self-compassion, and to treat ourselves in the way that we readily, day in, day out, treat everyone else, because our expectations of ourselves tend to far outweigh the expectations that we have of others, apart from my poor children, who have exactly the high level of expectations on them as I do of myself. And on that note, there's a list of things there at the end that you're welcome to look at more. I realise I've whizzed through so much, I can't actually quite believe I managed to do it in the time. Let me try and stop this screen sharing, and then I'll just be able to see you all, I think. Brilliant. Let me just move you over here, see you and hear you. Hello, thank you for staying here for an hour and listening to me rambling on, and I hope there was the odd useful thing in amongst that.
Lucy, thank you so much. You are, as always, brilliant. And I know that you get nervous about these things, but you pitched it brilliantly and covered so much that's so relevant. Does anyone have any questions for Lucy before she goes? Anything they want to say, any feedback? I know you're incredibly busy, and I'm so grateful for your commitment.
Absolutely fine. My pleasure. And at the end of the handout, I've also put my email address is there. So if there's anything that comes up after your reflection, I'm posted anything or interested in anything, be in touch.
You're always so kind, and I know you make yourself available. We've got a hand up. So, unmute and ask your question. Is that Bridget?
It is, yeah. Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that. It's a brilliant talk. I just wondered, our junior trainees at Lucy, how do we get that message to them? And also, their more senior paediatricians who are their supervisors, how do we get the message, this kind of experience through to them? Because I was quite intrigued by the physicians' home partners saying that paediatricians are inclined to self-drug release, and so with a faculty as an underlying group, how we can share this. If you've got any podcasts that we can get them to listen to, translate it.
Bridget, your sound isn't great, but I think I captured your question. So first of all, I captured your question, but we are doing a video with Lucy and Ruth Shepherd, so covering some of this. It'll be much shorter, obviously. So it was really clear as we ran this for the returners that everyone wanted it. And I was saying to the others that we'd have consultant faculty on our return programme, and I'd lose them because they'd want to listen to Lucy's talk, of course. And so we actually were meant to film in January, weren't we, Lucy? And we've had to reschedule because of the pandemic. But some of the work we're doing, we're releasing an educational resource video with some of the talk that Lucy did today, with lots of trainees involved. And then there'll be signposts to the resources that Lucy's talked about. You're right that it needs to be available for educators as well. So certainly with the psychology aspect, we haven't taken that to the educational supervision programme yet, but it's a really good thought that we could think about that. Lucy, did you want to come in? I don't know if you could hear all that question. It was just about getting it out to everyone and making resources available. I've lost you as well. Oh.
I muted myself. When it was all noisy, I thought maybe it was me earlier. It wasn't, but I muted myself. Yes, I agree. And I think maybe there are other areas of your sort of extended network that we could usefully, whether it's share the recording, do some sessions like this. As I said, these sort of can come at these sessions from so many angles, but maybe also there are some useful concrete resources that we can produce, something material for people to have in hand about some of these things might be useful. In terms of sort of podcasts, I mean, there is so much stuff out there. It's a bit overwhelming, I think, when you go and look for things. So again, it might be that we could, I've never done it, but have a little bit of a focused look and identify some of the best. And if they're not there, well, let's create our own, something that's going to be, really useful and targeted at the groups we're thinking about.
Yeah, really, really good idea. So I always talked to Nick Prince about this, who does a lot of the IT for us, and he says a podcast is much harder to do than a webinar or a video, which is why we've gone with the shorter videos at the moment, but definitely happy to learn and develop.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was brilliant. Thank you.
Was there anyone else who wanted to ask Lucy any questions or say anything? I don't mind. At the moment, we're running Return to Practice 6 times a year, and this aspect is virtual. So if you have someone you think who would benefit, they can log in for this specific aspect. We run it on Zoom, so if you just send me an email, you have trainees who think might benefit, even if they're not returners, they can log in for this aspect because we do have capacity for that. So there's dates on the website, the School of Peds website, or just email me and I can coordinate.
Amazing. So thank you so much, Lucy. That was so insightful and definitely a lot of things to think about. And I've just followed you on Twitter as well as your the company that runs all the coaching, Hello Self, and already picked up lots of different tips already. So thank you so much for joining us today. If anyone else has any questions or anything, please just let me or Trisha know and we can pass them on to Lucy going forward. In the interest of time, our next speaker, I believe, has entered the room. So I'm just going to introduce him. So an unfamiliar face for everyone.
I bumped into Lucy at the Nunhead Cemetery just last weekend.
Yes, yes, very nice. I was just going to say one thing before I jump off, and I'll leave you be, Simon, but was just that the handout, I can't work out how to attach it in the chat. So I'm Nisha and Trish, I'll just email it to you and you can see it.
Okay.
All right.
That's great.
Take
care.
Cheers, Lucy. Thank you.
Bye.
Great.